I will try to respond to a couple of questions. First is education. I think your question was about the rates. The pastoral areas, the education level rates are very low. But in relation to resilience, I think in my mind, in long-term view, investment in education in the drylands, I think, has the greatest return on investment. In the long term, if you do the analysis, there's a lot of studies or evidence done. Peter Little and Emory University and Parima, and even more recently, UNDP did a study in northern Kenya, and they realized that households that have at least one member in education or who has another employment opportunity outside the drylands are likely to be more resilient than the ones who don't have any alternative livelihoods. So there's a lot of relationships on education. And just related to that is the issue of the youth. Many people, as I said, are transitioning out of pastoralism. They're coming to towns and urban centers. There's need for workforce development or skills training and jobs opportunities for these areas. So it's an area which is not really well developed, but I think there's a lot of opportunity to improve skills and educational opportunities for people who are in the drylands. I'm a believer in education. So I think it's really important to put a lot of investments or some investments in this area. Perceptions and how communities are responding to their own resilience. And I think recently with Ethiopia, USAID, we've just published a book. You can get a copy from the USAID stand. And there are examples about how communities perceive resilience and what are the key drivers of this. For example, conflict. If you don't access water, rangelands, then you become less resilient. So there are examples about how communities are managing or investing in their own resilience. So it's really important there are different examples, and it always varies from one point to another. Ecosystem approach. It's something new, but I think the first time I heard about resilience was in my undergraduate education when I did environment and natural resource. And at that time, I remember reading about resilient ecosystems was used in terms of ecology and rangelands and management. And I think it's an area which is continuously being developed. USAID Ethiopia, we have a project called Prime, Pastoral Areas Resilience Improvement through market expansion. We are looking at the market systems and also the rangeland and natural resource management. It's not just implementing activities in one point or another, but looking at the whole markets and value chain and identifying where those gaps or challenges are trying to resolve. The private sector, I think there are different models for private sector investments or innovations in this area. There are various examples where private sector can play a role. And if you want examples, I can give it to you. But one example I just want to mention is Sidai in northern Kenya that does social enterprise, and they work with community health workers and improve the drug value chain system in that communities. Private sectors can always mean many things. They can mean the small businesses, they can mean the big companies or whatever, but even financial services. In the drylands, access to credit or financial services is a big constraint. So working with the banks of financial services and trying to identify the constraints and helping them out. Finally, the funding, I think from USAID and even I've had so many development partners or donors now talking about flexible funding, ability to move money from emergency to development and vice versa. So I think in 2011, one of the greatest outcomes from development partners or donors is the ability to allow NGOs and implementing partners to move money around and be flexible. It's something I think that's coming out as one of the examples of 2011 response.
Thanks, Minister. Just two reflections on the PSNP and one on the funding issue also. This session's on resilience in the drought, resilience to drought in the whole of Africa, and the measurements and the early warning on drought is actually very sophisticated now. We shouldn't be surprised when drought happens, and so that really challenges us to have the systems and structures in place in order to respond quickly. I think over the last couple of years, when we look at how the PSNP has evolved and building on the lessons from 2011, is really having a very clear response mechanism within the structure. We know it's coming. There's no reason why we should be scrambling around trying to get the resources into the system and then use them appropriately. And the system has been working well, but again, I think what the lesson has been over the last period is when do wardas and regions use contingency funding? When do they use, what's the triggers? What's the triggers for using risk financing funding at a federal level? And I think that they're being clarified and becoming much clearer, and I think that's a very, very positive thing. Second point on the PSNP, one of the lessons recently over the years has been the very big difference between people in the highlands and pastoralists. And one of the approaches for the new programme will be having a cash-first principle in the highlands, recognising that the food markets in the highlands are quite sophisticated, and there's no need to be making food distributions as such. And that's very different, if you like, in the pastoralist areas where the food systems isn't as well developed. Equally, when IFPRI was doing the analysis of impact, you could see the impact at the highlands was very different from impact at the pastoralist level. And that was due to many issues, some of them cultural, some of them just access, some of them, many, many reasons. But it does point to the fact that if you're designing or engaged in a national level social accountability programme, not one size fits all. All communities and areas are very different. Finally, on the issue of funding, when Irish Aid recently updated its policy on global development and really took a resilience focus, one of the challenges coming out of that was, well, how do you make sure your funding is flexible to respond to that? So, for example, the challenge back to us as a country programme was ensure you've got long-term funding for partners, but also build in humanitarian funding. And if you don't need the humanitarian funding at the end of the year, then reprogram that into long-term funding. If you need more humanitarian funding, then make reallocations from your long-term funding into humanitarian. So we've had to change our systems and to build in that flexibility in order to be able to respond to the resilience agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. James.
Thank you, Chairman. I think most of the issues have been covered, but let me also mention 3 points. One was the issue of early warning, early response, and the issue of early warning information. My own view is that early warning information in the region now is very strong. It's been improved over the years, and most of this information actually is community-based. It is timely, it is credible as far as drought is concerned. And as we keep on improving on that information, I don't think that is the issue. For example, in Kenya, our biggest issue is the response is usually late because we don't have set-aside funds that we can use in a flexible manner, in a timely manner, to respond even to the earliest signs of the drought. So to us, it is the issue of the funds, and therefore we are in the process of establishing National Drought Contingency Fund that we can use immediately. The early warnings show some signals. So to us, it's the issue of the funds and not the information. Of course, the information will be refined as we go along. It is never 100%, but right now, in our view, the issue is the funds. But Chairman, number 2, I don't know whether it's been answered, but maybe it's been touched. There was the issue of involvement of the communities in these resilience issues as we work. It came from somewhere. Yes, we are involving the communities. The coverage is still very low, but now we are emphasizing in what we are calling community-managed disaster risk reduction. We work with the communities, take communities through certain systems so that they can identify their hazards, they can identify the potential impacts, they can identify their own capacity to respond, they can identify the gaps, and then the communities can come up with action plans on what should be done both in terms of long-term and short-term to reduce the risk. It is these community action plans, whether short-term or long-term, that we usually integrate in the national plans or the county plans, and therefore if we implement them, then we are responding to the community priorities. So we are doing that, because if I decide I'm going to do an investment somewhere, what would have informed me? It is either research or through working with the community. So I think community involvement is there. There was also the issue of urban resilience. Luca, did you cover it? Urban? No. Was it? Okay, cover it. It's a tough one for me. But you know, in the urban, the situation is different. We are talking of people who rely on wages, especially in the informal settlement. The wages are very low, and usually their biggest problem is high food prices and this temporary employment. That is usually their biggest problem. So the response in some of these urban areas is something to do with food subsidies, is something to do with some employment creation. But in urban areas, given the informal areas and given the cash wars and given the low wages, I think there's still a lot of work that we need to do there. In fact, some people think that the drought only affects the rural areas. It affects also the urban population. But we need to come up with a proper response, because it's the issue of the money. There was also a question that came from here. Was it on how we integrate nutrition in some of the actions? But I think I mentioned at the beginning that in the dry areas where we work, one sectoral approach only does not work. You cannot just go there with water, or you go there with agriculture, or you go there with health and nutrition. We have to integrate all the approaches together. And that's how they can work very well. And then there was the last one, who is resilience? How do we know who is resilience? I think it's also still working with the communities through the community-managed disaster risk reduction. So, Bwana Chairman, thank you. These are the areas I felt maybe were left, or I needed to emphasize a bit. Thank you.
Thank you.